Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly critical, really fascinating perspective on a notoriously complex geopolitical issue, nuclear diplomacy with Iran. Now, the source material we're looking at today makes a very pointed argument. It basically claims that past nuclear negotiations with Iran haven't just, fallen short of their goals, but have been fundamental strategic failures. The author makes the case that trying to negotiate with the current regime is not just futile, but actively dangerous, with ripple effects that could impact literally everything, from global security right down to your energy bills. So let's look at exactly how they build this argument. To really get a handle on all this, we're breaking the author's text down into 5 quick parts. We'll explore the illusion of diplomacy, dissect a failed deal, tally up the real costs of sanctions relief, navigate the shifting Middle East dynamics, and finally, look at the completely uncompromising alternative the author proposes. All right, kicking things off with part 1, the illusion of diplomacy, a flawed premise. The author argues right out of the gate that the entire premise of negotiating with the current Iranian regime is fundamentally flawed from the ground up. And this brilliantly illustrates that massive core disconnect. You see, while the Western view of diplomacy focuses on things like compromise, sanctions relief, and good faith engagement to achieve regional stability, well, the source claims Tehran views negotiations entirely differently. Actually, to them, diplomacy is a tactical weapon. It's just a way to buy time, divide Western allies, and secure economic relief, all while quietly continuing their long-term strategic goals. To really drive home how the author views the regime's core identity, the text highlights a super vivid quote from U.S. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. He referred to the regime's leaders as terrorists with an oil field. Now, the source uses this quote specifically to emphasize their belief that the regime's hostility isn't just, political rhetoric. It's their entire reason for being. Therefore, the author argues, any diplomatic agreement is not going to moderate them. It's only going to embolden them. Moving right along to our second section, Anatomy of a Failed Deal, specifically looking back at the 2015 JCPOA. To prove their point that negotiations just don't work, the author frames this past nuclear deal as the ultimate proof of diplomatic failure. Let's move to and see how this builds. The source argues that Washington repeatedly falls into this cyclical nightmare. Basically, it starts with talks, which lead to temporary understandings. But then, the author claims, come the inevitable violations by the regime, which loop us right back into renewed crises. It's a trap that the author believes consumes enormous diplomatic energy while allowing Iran to consistently act in bad faith. Looking specifically at that 2015 deal, the author's postmortem is pretty scathing. They point out that the deal provided Tehran with sanctions relief and access to billions of dollars, but merely delayed their nuclear and ballistic programs rather than permanently dismantling them. The source claims Iran exploited what they call pitifully weak enforcement loopholes, and instead of changing their behavior for the better, the regime actually used the opportunity to expand its support for terror. A massive chunk of the author's critique centers on these things called sunset clauses. The text explicitly warns that sunset clauses do not eliminate the nuclear threat at all. Instead, they merely act as a green light for the regime to quietly continue rebuilding its weapons program the second those restrictions expire. In fact, the source argues that even if a new deal doesn't have these clauses, Tehran is still just going to view it as a temporary pause before they resume advanced uranium enrichment. Which brings us to Section 3, the cost of sanctions relief, deadly consequences. The source material is crystal clear here that easing economic pressure has tangible, real-world, deadly consequences. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the text traces exactly where it claims these billions in sanctions relief actually go. Enriching the regime, they argue, directly fuels its terror proxies. For Hezbollah up in Lebanon, it means more drones and rockets. For Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad over in Gaza, it means more weapons and training. And for the Houthis down in Yemen, it translates directly to those ballistic missiles we've seen threatening vital commercial shipping lanes in the Red Sea. But the threat isn't just funneled through proxies, right? The source reports that Iran has reportedly already restarted much of its own ballistic missile production and could restore significant offensive drone capabilities within a matter of months. The author asserts that these negotiations basically just provide the regime with the financial padding they need to rapidly rebuild military capabilities that threaten not just Israel but global energy security as well. Beyond the immediate military threats, the text outlines some pretty heavy moral and geopolitical costs. The author argues that striking a deal actually undermines American deterrence worldwide. making enemies view diplomacy as a sign of weakness. Furthermore, they argue that rewarding a regime that brutalizes its own people with international legitimacy normalizes systematic human rights abuses. Ultimately, the source says it sends a really dangerous message, that blackmail and defiance actually produce economic rewards. Let's pivot over to Section 4, Shifting Middle East Dynamics, Regional Complexity. Here, the author ties these diplomatic critiques directly to former President Trump's maneuvers in the broader region. So, the text specifically looks at Trump's demands for Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Pakistan to join the Abraham Accords. The source notes that responses from these nations have been, well, unenthusiastic, or they've just flatly rejected the idea. Why? Well, the author views this pressure as kind of a PR distraction. They argue it's an attempt to offset the criticism of a forthcoming, flawed deal with Iran by manufacturing a diplomatic win somewhere else. As the author pointedly puts it in the text, peace made at gunpoint rarely lasts. Adding to all this regional complexity, the author takes direct aim at the countries supposedly facilitating the Iran deal, pointing to specific evidence of their bias. For instance, Pakistan's defense minister announced standing by Iran after October 7th. Turkey's President Erdogan has openly called for Israel's destruction. Saudi Arabia refused the U.S. use of the Prince Sultan airbase, and Qatar's state-owned Al Jazeera has been flagged for promoting anti-Israel incitement. The author's whole point here is that these facilitators have well-worn records of not being neutral at all. So, you might be wondering, why would these countries facilitate a deal in the first place? Well, the source outlines a fascinating three-step theory. First, a deal prevents Iranian missile strikes on their own soil. Second, the author claims these countries might actually prefer a weakened Iranian regime overseeing Israel's stature in the Middle East strengthen. And third, keeping the current regime in place maintains the option for these countries to resume targeting Israel after Trump leaves office. It's a highly cynical view of regional diplomacy for sure, but it's completely central to the author's critique. And that leads us to our final section, the proposed alternative, an uncompromising path. The author doesn't just sit back and critique past and present failures, they actually outline a very specific, uncompromising path forward. So the crucial point is this. The source believes there is literally only one realistic strategy. It includes sustained maximum pressure, including kinetic or military action if absolutely necessary. It calls for total diplomatic isolation, strict economic sanctions, and decisive measures aimed at the permanent dismantlement of Iran's nuclear and ballistic programs. As you can see, there is absolutely no middle ground offered in this text. To underline just how strictly the author holds this view, the text delivers a really stark final warning. They state that anything less than this hardline alternative will simply postpone the next crisis, all while making the Iranian regime richer, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous. And it leaves us with a profound, provocative question based on everything we've just unpacked. Does diplomacy always guarantee peace? Or can it sometimes actually fund future conflicts? It's an incredibly complex issue with massive, real-world geopolitical stakes. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this source material on The Explainer today. Keep questioning and keep learning.